Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Accessible Transportation Resource Center's office hours. The ATRC office hours is a webinar series promoting accessible transportation resource strategies and facilitating conversations on accessibility. My name is Grayson Lee, and I am the director of ATRC. Could you go to the next slide? This webinar is an hour long. There will be an opportunity at the end for Q&A, and please feel free to add comments in the chat as we go along and to put questions in the Q&A box. At the end, we'll also have time for, if you prefer, to raise your hand virtually and ask your question that way at the end. Next slide. Thank you. The Accessible Transportation Resource Center, if you're not aware, is a national technical assistance center funded by the Administration for Community Living under the Department of Health and Human Services. The goal of ATRC is to promote strategies making transportation more accessible, to increase awareness, to expand the adoption of accessible transportation strategies, and to make accessible transportation the norm. Next slide, please. Some resources on from ATRC are available on our website, resources on accessibility and inclusive planning. We also have a monthly newsletter that goes out through the National Accessible Transportation Accelerator Network, which is there to connect anyone who cares about accessible transportation with resources and best practices. That's also where you'll get announcements about our office hours. We also offer technical assistance for free to address accessibility challenges in your community. And you can find all of this on our website, which I will put in the chat. I now want to introduce our presenter today, Eric Sinagra. Eric is the CEO and co-founder of pathVu, a company focused on making sidewalks more accessible and walkable for people with disabilities. I'm now going to hand it over to Eric.
Thank you, Grayson, and thank you everyone for joining today. Really excited to be here, tell you a little bit more about some of the work that we've seen or the work that we do around sidewalk accessibility. But first, as Grayson mentioned, my name is Eric Sinagra. I'm the CEO and co-founder of pathVu. Our goal is to be the Google Maps of sidewalks, focused on the sidewalk infrastructure and mobility and where those two items intersect. I'll talk a lot about accessibility and sidewalks, and when I use those terms, I'm really referring to any pedestrian pathway, sidewalk, curb ramp, crosswalk, and also looking at accessibility from more of a holistic universal design approach, looking at how any individual can use the sidewalk network. A short history about myself and pathVu. My passion for this work stems from my brother, Nick, who uses a wheelchair, our co-founder, John, who also uses a wheelchair, and my father-in-law, who is visually impaired. So that's kind of the core passion for the work that we are doing, focused on improving sidewalk accessibility. So what I'll be talking about today is starting with the importance of accessible sidewalks. Why does it matter? What makes sidewalks accessible? Looking at some federal guidelines, looking at some of the challenges in maintaining a good sidewalk and accessible sidewalk network, methods for actually improving sidewalk accessibility and mobility. Our approach that we've used in the past and today, continuing on with a case study from some of the work that we've done, and then wrapping up with accessible pedestrian navigation. How do you actually help individuals understand the best routes to travel? And so a lot of what I'm talking about today comes from my experience. There's plenty more to discuss beyond just this webinar, but these are some of the items that I've seen during my research and work with pathVu. So I like to start with a short user story. Meet John. John here on the screen, he's traveling down the sidewalk on his way to work, or maybe it's a doctor appointment, or maybe he's just going out to find some food at a restaurant for lunch. But he comes across a sign in the middle of the sidewalk that says sidewalk closed. So now John has to turn around, go back, find an alternate route maybe, waste time, money. Maybe he never makes it to his doctor's appointment and needs to find reschedule, and ultimately just limits his independence and limits his ability to have that quality of life. And these types of stories are very common for many individuals, but especially those with disabilities, trying to find the best routes along sidewalks. And so these poor sidewalks, as I mentioned, they really limit social participation and can cause isolation for many people, especially people with disabilities, older adults. Sidewalk conditions like what you see on the screen here, such as cracked sidewalks, level changes, poles in the middle of the sidewalk, can cause injuries, can cause people to trip and fall. Older adults, 1 in 3, trip and fall. So sidewalks are a major issue. And this social isolation that I mentioned can actually lead to major health risks, such as decreased quality of life, limiting access to things like food, education, and healthcare, and ultimately other health-related issues. This very much shows the importance of a well-maintained sidewalk network, which is one of the key components in the social determinants of health. So sidewalks don't only affect people with disabilities that I've talked about a lot. As I mentioned, we're looking at this from more of a universal design perspective. It affects all users of the sidewalk. It has a greater impact on people with disabilities because of some of the challenges that they might face from poorly maintained sidewalks, but it affects kids walking to school, as you see on the screen, where the student has to walk in the middle of the street. Parents with strollers, but also even autonomous robots. It's kind of a hot topic nowadays, but it's kind of the world that we're living in now, where many types of users have to share the sidewalk, and trying to understand the best routes for all types of users. So what are the benefits of a well-maintained sidewalk? In general, well-maintained sidewalks improve access, mobility, safety, and independence. They help make our communities more livable and have economic impacts as well, such as higher property values, and even access to restaurants and stores that can boost the economy for those points of interest as well. But what is an accessible sidewalk? What are the things that determine whether it's accessible or not? And so what we like to go by is PROAG. PROAG is the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, published by the Access Board, and much research has gone into their publications on and how they determine what an accessible sidewalk is, what an accessible curb ramp is, and other attributes. Some of those key components that PROAG talks about and that are part of that pedestrian network are things like sidewalks, curb ramps, pedestrian signals, bus stops, and even street parking. These pieces are some of the things that we often look at for accessibility, whether the curb ramp exists, whether it has a steep running slope, whether there's a tripping hazard or a level change on the sidewalk, whether there's a narrow width where a wheelchair user may not be able to pass by. Even things like low clearances, where somebody with a visual impairment might not be able to see that obstruction approaching, And so we want to understand how to mitigate those types of risks to decrease injuries from running into those obstacles. And then things like roughness that I'll talk about shortly. So some of these items that I mentioned that affect accessibility in a well-maintained sidewalk network include things like passing spaces on the sidewalk. Is it wide enough for, say, two wheelchair users to pass by? And is there a space that, every 200 feet where if two wheelchair users are approaching or two individuals are approaching, where there's enough room to have a waiting space and pass by with clear enough width. Things like transit stops. Is there a loading area, and is it flat and easily accessible for somebody to load onto the bus? What is a level change and what is the maximum allowable for a level change? And in reality, there is no allowable level change. But according to ProWag, anything a quarter of an inch or less is acceptable, and then anything between a quarter of an inch and a half of an inch is okay if it's rounded, if it's beveled, and anything above a half-inch level change is non-compliant. And so how do we identify those areas that are non-compliant? And then also things like on-street parking. Are there access routes to get from the parking to the sidewalk network itself? So where our company started and our research started was at the University of Pittsburgh. I did my master's there graduated in 2014, um, focused on rehabilitation sciences. And my research looked at how to measure sidewalk roughness and how it relates to wheelchair user comfort. Um, Research before that showed that wheelchair users were experiencing neck and back pain and attributed that to rough sidewalks. Some of the images that you see on the screen here include certain types of paver surfaces, cracked surfaces. We have some simulated wooden surfaces that we engineered to be able to measure roughness and what level of vibration exposure wheelchair users were experienced to, and then understand what levels were acceptable and what vibration levels were not acceptable that could cause neck and back pain. So, achieving everything that I talked about and more, this well-maintained, accessible sidewalk network is very daunting and difficult. Common reasons for poor sidewalks include things like just lack of data, not even knowing where your sidewalks are located in a city. Data collection itself can be tedious and time-consuming. The image in the top shows me using a tape measure and a level, which is backbreaking, time-consuming work to collect high-quality data. They're not planning tools are not very sidewalk centric. They focus on road networks and don't allow for good planning methods and good prioritization of sidewalk improvements. There can also be poor design or construction. In the bottom image, you see a close-up of a curb ramp where there's actually about an inch and a half or 2 inch level change from the street to the curb ramp. That was a new curb ramp where I'm located in Pittsburgh, and so that might have been designed well, but it was constructed poorly where there was a lip at the curb there. And then things like local policies, who owns and who's responsible for repairing the sidewalk? Is the city reactive or are they proactive in maintaining that? And also just in general, a lack of awareness, understanding the importance of a well maintained sidewalk and the importance of an accessible sidewalk. We've heard a lot, ignorance is bliss. If I don't know about an issue, I'm not responsible or it doesn't matter. And that's not true. And a lot of times cities face lawsuits due to inaccessible, an inaccessible sidewalk network, such as the case in LA, where they're now committing over $1 billion to improving their sidewalk network. And so this is very common across the country where there's trip and fall injuries or there's lawsuits around accessibility. But where do we start? Um, we believe that you don't know how to improve unless you know the current status of your sidewalk and pedestrian network. You don't know how to proceed unless you have the data on where to go first, where to prioritize, how to improve first. So, how to improve your sidewalks? Common ways include your city conducting an ADA transition plan and self-evaluation. We work with cities quite often to help them collect this type of public right-of-way data, understand where the barriers are, and use that data to prioritize improvements, develop budgets to go from where they are to hopefully a fully accessible pedestrian network in the future. It doesn't need to be done all right away. There can be a plan that can be developed to do it over time. And that's also where some of the misknowledge comes in. Sometimes that ignorance is bliss mentality. People believe that by doing a transition plan, you open yourself up to litigation by having that data. But the opposite is quite true, where by doing the transition plan, you defend yourself and you actually have a strategic process to improve accessibility across the city. Other ways of improving sidewalks can include things like an active transportation plan. And I know oftentimes there are funding sources for both the transition plans and active transportation plans. As I mentioned, doing things like collecting data to help prioritization. You can do a walk audit in your neighborhood or in your city. I'll talk about that a little bit here shortly, but how can we get the community involved? How can you be an advocate for improving accessibility in your community, helping capture that data, bringing awareness to those locally to make those changes, including potential policy changes, such as taking the ownership off of the property owner and maybe bringing it to the city itself, or maybe it's a shared ownership or a shared cost to get the sidewalks replaced. So sometimes those, maybe none of those are the perfect way, but sometimes those can help to actually get action taken in sidewalks fixed. So what's pathVu's approach? Our approach is focused on the intersection of technology and where it meets both infrastructure and mobility. How do all of those kind of combine using the data that we collect to help not only prioritize those improvements, but help the individual understand the best routes to travel? So I'm going to show a short case study here of some data dashboard from a project in Chino, California. So tell me if you can't see my screen for the dashboard, but what you see here now is a map of a lot of data in Chino. We collected information about sidewalks, curb ramps, pedestrian signals, transit stops. And so in this tool that we worked with them, they were very engaged to help us understand what their priorities are, and they really cared about improving their accessibility. So we helped them develop this tool to prioritize, and you can see things like where the sidewalk gaps are in black on the map here on the screen, or where the sidewalks are located. And as I zoom in here, the city can understand as it updates, they can understand where their sidewalks are, the conditions of those sidewalks. You can see the green, orange, and red based off of the condition. And then each sidewalk segment has all of the data about the slopes and the widths, and is there a level change, and additional information about that. And so we really help them to complete that entire assessment and understand how to prioritize. Now you see an image of what was collected, and there's a level change going from the sidewalk to the driveway. So understanding how that all relates to the bigger picture across the city. But then also looking at curb ramps, you can see dots again of green, orange, and red of the curb ramps looking at all the various measurements of what is accessible and not, and then an image of that particular curb ramp. So again, based off of that, we can help them understand, um, maybe where people are traveling most, and those are the areas to prioritize. Or maybe you prioritize the low clearances, because a lot of times those are the areas where you need to trim trees. Or maybe you want to look at all the level changes an inch or more across the city. And so those are some of the things that we worked with Chino to help them to implement into this tool. So going back to our approach, for that project and a lot of the work that we do to collect this high fidelity data, we use tools like our pathMet tool for sidewalk data collection and our curb ramp tool for curb ramp data collection. These are high fidelity tools that capture ADA level accuracy, making it more efficient for the technician so they don't need to put a tape measure and a level down every curb ramp, or don't need to put it down every 10 feet for a sidewalk. It automatically takes those measurements and every millimeter images every 10 feet. And so we can integrate that into platforms like I just showed you for Chino. And we've done a lot of work throughout the country, helping cities develop their transition plans or their general sidewalk improvement plans. Over 11,000 miles and 80,000 curb ramps. And we've done projects in all the states highlighted in orange, included places like California, Texas, Pennsylvania, and others. And then we partner with a lot of engineering firms who do this type of work, highlighted in those dots, their offices at those dotted locations. So these tools are what I call the like engineering grade or the ADA level of data collection. But we all know that um, not every project, not every city has the budget to do a full assessment or the highest quality assessment. So we also like to do various levels of data collection through things like walk audits, as I mentioned, maybe looking at Google Street View and identifying the condition of those, using maybe semi-automated data collection through smartphones, or even using crowdsourcing through mobile applications. There's benefits to each method of data collection, primarily speed versus data fidelity versus cost. Typically, the faster it is, the lower the fidelity, and oftentimes then the lower the cost. When we were doing a number of years ago, we worked with CTAA to do, they were in town for a meeting, and they did a walk audit across all of downtown Pittsburgh. And just in an afternoon with a number of people, we were able to capture information across all of downtown. You can see numerous points in um, in the downtown region of hazards that were identified. And in particular, this particular image shown here shows a narrow segment on the pathway where maybe a wheelchair user would have a hard time navigating that route. So these are quick ways to collect lots of data and advocate for those improvements in your community. So I'd like to wrap up my presentation talking about mobility and navigation. We all know that cities are often slow to make repairs and often can face those lawsuits that I talked about. But even before those improvements are made, as part of the transition plan or other planning, how can we help individuals understand those accessible routes to travel? And so back in, I believe it was 2017, we worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation under their ATRC program for accessible transportation. We developed a prototype pedestrian navigation app focused on accessibility. I'll tell you more about it in a moment, but we're actually going to be implementing that app in Sacramento County, hopefully starting in the fall. So we're going to be taking, all of this type of data and implementing it into that. So now you'll understand the best routes to travel. The ATRC program used the concept of the complete trip, and as do we in our development of this app. The complete trip has primarily 5 steps. The first step is planning and booking your trip. The second step is traveling to maybe a transit station, such as a bus stop. The third step is riding the bus. The fourth step is crossing the street, and the fifth step is arriving at your destination. So, if at any point during the journey any one of these steps is inaccessible, then that means that it can be inaccessible completely for a person with a disability and cause them not to be able to reach their destination. So as part of our development, we really focus on the pedestrian, the sidewalk piece, but how can we integrate transit stations, crossing the street, and some of these other components into our multimodal navigation? So when we were doing our project with the U.S. Department of Transportation, we did a few focus groups. I'm going to share a few of the feedback from 2 focus groups. The first is with wheelchair users and those with mobility disabilities. Primarily, their feedback, there's plenty more, but the feedback primarily consisted around, can I get there? Are there impassable segments? Are there things like construction and major hazards or major narrow widths where I just cannot get to my destination? Are there curb ramps where I can actually get to the intersection and cross the street? And beyond that, is the bus accessible? Can I get on the bus? And is there enough room for me to get on or off? These are just a few of the things that we heard from that focus group. And the next focus group, for those who are blind or visually impaired, we heard similar things, but also more unique components. They really like to understand how to do what we call pre-trip planning, creating that mental map of where they are traveling so they understand what they're going to experience before they actually experience it. When you're out in the community, what happens if you get disoriented and turned around? Now trying to understand how to reorient yourself. Where are the major barriers and low clearances so that they can avoid those obstacles? Having navigation cues that are accurate to understand how to turn properly. Where are there changes in the route that they're used to so that they can understand, that and have confidence that they're navigating an accessible route, based off of those changes. Points of interest. As you're passing by Starbucks, knowing that it's Starbucks and knowing that you walk by there every day and you understand where you are oriented in space, or even having other pieces of guides along a building or along an edge of a curb to understand, again, where you are down the sidewalk. And then similarly to the to wheelchair users, when is the bus going to arrive? When is it time to get off the bus so you know that you're at your stop and your destination? We also talked with people with hearing disabilities and cognitive disabilities that I'm not necessarily including here, but we often heard some great feedback from them as well. So building our navigation app, what are we looking to include in it? Things like real-time, step-by-step navigation down the sidewalk network, building in multimodal navigation as well, when the bus is arriving, where to go from there, which bus to take. Using the actual sidewalk network itself rather than the street network that, say, Google uses. Configurable and customized routes. Not every individual is the same. Not every wheelchair user is the same. One wheelchair user may be able to traverse a particular hazard, while another one, it creates a complete barrier where they cannot traverse that. So building into the app itself configurable settings that are customized based off of each user's abilities rather than assumptions based off of, say, generalizations. Building in things like favorites, favorite places that I pass by, and alerting to me to those places that I'm passing by. Hazard reports, being able to report that there's an obstruction, as well as being alerted that you're about to approach those obstructions. Other things like accessible points of interest. Can I get into a building? Not necessarily wayfinding in the building, but can I get in there? Is the restaurant accessible? Can I at least make it in, have enough room comfortably to get to my table, use the restroom, and be able to enjoy my experience? And other components as well that we'll be building out soon with Sacramento County. So using this mentality, autonomous vehicles are a major topic. And so, how can we use our navigation as that complete trip idea? Imagine one day you're in an autonomous vehicle, an accessible autonomous vehicle. You get out, it tells you using these types of directions how to go from A to B, and then now you find the next autonomous taxi or the next you take the bus that to get to your destination. How does all of this work together? And we very much see this as part of that complete trip, and not necessarily using autonomous vehicles to replace anything in particular, but just painting the picture of the bigger vision of how all of this information can tie together from sidewalks to streets to autonomous vehicles and everything working together for an accessible trip. And lastly with that, a short about 2-minute demo of our app. So this was developed a few years back. The prototype, how it works is you sign in using either custom Google or Facebook or custom login. You sign in, you create a user ID, and then once you log in, you can say what type of user you are. So you can either choose from a preset list of settings, or you can configure those settings. You can identify what types of information on the map and the screen are important to you. And then from here, it takes you to the main map screen. You can do what we call set a new path, which is your real-time A to B navigation. So just like any other navigation app, you say where it is that you're traveling to. And after you type in that location, it comes and it produces a route for you based off of all of the settings that you've set, as well as the data about the sidewalk network, which path is accessible. So in this particular case, it's taking me down the right side of the street, again down the right side, and then it tells me to cross the street at this particular point. So rather than continuing me straight down the sidewalk, it's having me go across the street for some reason. And so that could be because the left side of the road is more accessible than the right side. So using information like that to actually identify or determine what route is best. And it actually shows there that there's a missing sidewalk, maybe due to construction there. And then kind of continuing on with this, with the demo here, now I can go in and I can maybe modify my settings, tell the app what routes I prefer, how comfortable I am. Sorry, I meant to go back. There we go. So how comfortable I am navigating things like steep slopes, or level changes or curb ramps and things like that. So now, based off of the modified settings, it's taking me now a different route. Maybe it's a little bit longer, but I know it's an accessible route based off of my condition or my ability to navigate. And so just kind of wrapping up here, you can again see some images of things that are crowdsourced, and then look at your favorite destinations and various aspects like that. So with that, thank you again for this opportunity to present today. And are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Eric. We did get a bunch of questions in the chat and Q&A, and so I'll read some um, off. Let's see. Elaine is asking what would be covered in a walk audit and is looking for information such as beginner's document to use if they're looking to conduct a walk audit in their community.
So the data or the information to collect is pretty configurable based off of your community's needs. Common things include items like um, tripping hazards or broken sidewalks, so looking more at the pavement. It can even include things like the low clearances and overgrowth that I was talking about. Oftentimes, you can find a lot of vegetation that can cause obstructions. It can you can collect things about missing curb ramps or deteriorating curb ramps. So it's very configurable. I like to, when with our walk audits, I like to do what I call subjectively objective data collection. So it's essentially it's subjective, but it's from drop downs. So you're kind of rating it on a good, fair, poor level rather than specifically taking measurements. There are also other programs out there, even like AARP, that have some walk audit information. ATRC has resources. And then as far as documentation, I can always provide things, at another time for the best practices and things like that.
Thanks, Eric. And yeah, Elaine, there's a great resource in the chat there on from AARP, a walk audit toolkit, and feel free to contact ATRC and we can connect you with some more resources as well. Another question asks, I'd like to get a bit technical and ask about data standards in this space. What are the implications of data standards on your work? What data can and can't you get to easily to create a comprehensive picture of the pedestrian right of way? How can we create a rich data environment to make such data available for tools like yours? Any thoughts on the national collaboration on bicycle, pedestrian, and accessibility infrastructure data?
That is a loaded question, and thank you for that. So there are around even sidewalks, there are some sidewalk standards that are being developed around the type of data, such as out of the University of Washington. I know they're developing the open sidewalk um, uh, standards. We have certain approaches that we use. We developed our roughness standard on how to measure roughness, and uh, I think it's often a tough question because you have a lot of different people. This is in any sort of field where you have a lot of different people kind of doing things in parallel, where I think one of the key items is how do we collaborate so that not everybody is doing everything in parallel, but it's coming together in some fashion. I know a lot of work that a lot of our data, it might say something is a level change, uh, and maybe Open Sidewalks calls it something else, or another platform calls it something else. One of the main things is understanding just that structure and that schema of the data so that we can implement ours into their system. We break our data oftentimes up into 10-foot segments, but we can also then merge it across or use aggregate it across an entire block. So that data can kind of integrate together to some of these standards. I know I'm not fully answering your question 100%, but I think a lot of it has to do with collaborating and just understanding what we don't know is the best way to start.
On a similar point, Camille asked, have you ever looked at coordinating with navigation apps like Google Maps to be able to provide the sidewalk quality information in those apps? And then another person commented, is there a way to leverage your work and data and see it more broadly disseminated in commonly used apps?
Um, we have uh, we have had discussions with Google and looked at potentially how this could be integrated at some point. It's kind of a piece on its own. That I think is ultimately the bigger vision, is not necessarily Google per se. They're definitely a key player, but there are other navigation apps and similar apps that could benefit from this type of navigation. So what we envision is um, that the data can be integrated and the actual routing and navigation can be integrated into any type of system. Maybe it's Google, maybe Waze starts doing pedestrian navigation, maybe Apple Maps is interested. So there's a number of different ways. So how can we develop kind of the back end infrastructure of how this accessible navigation works, and then from there, partnering with those different companies. And what was the follow-up second question?
It was similar. It was asking if there was a way to leverage your work and data and see it more broadly disseminated in commonly used apps. So sort of the same question. Yeah.
I think the challenge there is just uh, kind of what I mentioned earlier, creating those relationships. Um, and some things, I know we've talked about like some open data. So sometimes, maybe utilizing data that we collect into open platforms that can be more easily and freely, used by a number of different people. But then you have other methods like those organizations where it might be more of a partnership that's required.
Camille also asked, how do you join the crowdsourcing of sidewalk info?
So our app right now is not on the App Store. We developed the initial version, the prototype, because of just the nature of the project. We had it up there for a little bit, had to take it down just due to some maintenance. So now our goal is to, um, as part of the Sacramento project, we will implement it in Sacramento, and then we will continue to add additional cities from there as either data becomes available, as we capture data, and other sort of methods from there. So the app will be called pathVu Navigation. At least that's our current plan for the name. And then from there, you can actually opt into using the app to collect data, freely, and as you're walking around, and you approach a particular obstacle, then it becomes visible and available for other people to either see or be alerted to through the app. For things like the walk audit, it's something more specifically where we would help you to develop a walk audit, mobile app essentially to go walk around and collect that type of data. It's a little bit different, but similar.
Thanks, Eric. And I know there are also other organizations that you can, if you're interested in crowdsourcing sidewalk info, like open sidewalks that are out there and available for to contribute to as well. We do have someone who raised their hand. So Kelly, um, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Kelly Soriano. I work for Monterey Salinas Transit, and I do work in the mobility department. And so we always do the scouting too for our seniors who are on wheelchairs, all kinds of mobility devices. But we use the transit app, of course, Google Maps. But it would be amazing for us if we can integrate that into transit app because in the transit app we can say the conditions of the road. I mean, with MSP, it already prompts us for like garbage. Is there a place to throw garbage? Do we have a seat? But if we could also integrate sidewalks in there, maybe the cities can, I don't know, the city will be working on fixing the sidewalks, or, maybe it could be sent right away to the different cities. Because, we're all over the county here in Monterey. And so, as you know, there's a lot of not very good sidewalks pretty much everywhere. Because I go everywhere in the county. But anyway, to integrate that and maybe get that sent over to whoever's in charge in the cities to go ahead and fix those sidewalks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. So the first part, I believe you mentioned the transit app. That very much is in line, I think, with kind of that Google mentality, if you will. So our goal is not to duplicate what other companies have done and reinvent the wheel, but rather focus on what we do best, which is sidewalk accessibility and mobility. So I would love to see that too, where our navigation is tied into, say, the transit app, where now it's going, you pick up, you walk down the sidewalk, it takes you that route based off of our data. And then once you get to the transit, ties all of the transit data into the app, and everything kind of works together. Kind of taking almost a step further, there's we'll be working with Carnegie Mellon University, who've developed a tool for safe intersection crossing. So now understanding when the street light, especially for people with visual impairments, understanding when the street light turns to walk, the pedestrian signal turns to walk, how much time you have, which direction to cross. So all of these sort of pieces of that puzzle can go from, sidewalks to crossings to the transit itself. And in regards to, integrating with it, I think I heard, the county's data or something like that. Um, this similar type of data, whether it's crowdsourced, walk audit, our equipment, whatever it may be, primarily crowdsourced, I would say. So that data can actually, through different technical methods, could integrate to the city or the county's 311 system, and then can potentially even feed back data back to, say, the app. And that's actually what we'll be working with in part with Sacramento County to do, is it reports through the app. That app data goes to the county, and then the county can help update the app itself. So everything is kind of kept as updated as possible, including things like construction locations.
Thanks, Eric. Another question in the chat asks, is that map of cities you have worked with available anywhere on your website? I would love to zoom in and see more details of the cities that you have worked with.
Um, no, it's not available on the website. Oftentimes, so those cities, whenever we work with them, oftentimes, we give them the information, and some of them make it public, some of them don't make it public. So as far as the data itself, that's kind of how we approach it. We don't. They essentially have the control over what they want to do with it. But as far as where we've worked with, I'm happy to, share, who we've worked with in the past offline to, you know, uh, share, who we've talked with.
Thanks. Another question asks, what about snow removal and ice dams, also rural areas with no sidewalks?
Um, Very important challenges and challenging challenges. What I often say is that when we get to the point where we can understand dynamically where snow and ice is located, on a, hour by hour basis, we'll say, I know that we're doing our job. I live in Pittsburgh, so we have snow, ice, similar issues. It piles up on the sidewalk or in the middle of the curb ramp, and it just makes things inaccessible, to say the least. So part of the goal would be to implement that into the app where a ton of people would be using it, and so you can actually update where snow and ice are, and then hopefully the next person comes and can report where it's not anymore. The more challenging piece is actually getting it removed, keeping the property owners held responsible for maintaining that. That's a little bit more of a challenging component to the snow and ice piece. And then the follow-up to that was the last part. What was the second part of the question?
The second part was asking, what about rural areas with no sidewalks?
Um, that's where I think apps like transit or multimodal apps really come into play. Um, and the challenge too is sometimes a street is the only way to get there. And so I don't know, it's hard. It's a hard balance between saying that, hey, you should go down this street, because really you shouldn't have to, but sometimes that's the only way to travel. And so trying to find that fine line between saying you definitely shouldn't go down this highway versus here's a residential street or residential road. You need to make it to this other road in order to get the transit from, from the rural area. And then from there, you can take the transit into wherever it is that you're going. It's not an easy challenge, but it is something that we are considering and how that all kind of integrates into the bigger capabilities of the app. Not forgetting those areas.
A question in the chat asks, do you measure cross slope? I may have missed the mention.
We do measure cross slope. The typical measurements are things like running slope, cross slope, level changes, roughness, width, low clearances, overgrowth, and a number of other configurable components. We kind of rate and score everything. Those are just a few of the sidewalk measurements. For curb ramps, there's many more things like the landing. Is there a landing? And, are there any level changes? Lots of other kind of conditions for an ADA assessment.
Another question was about, do the crowdsourced images have alt text?
Right now in the prototype, we don't have that built in just because it was a prototype, but that is a great comment to make sure that we include that. Everything in the app, other than everything else in the app has that alt text built in. Maps themselves can be a little tricky for accessibility, so that will be a longer process, but all the other components will be voiceover, talkback, accessible, have that appropriate alt text. But the actual images are an interesting component that I'm not sure that we had that on the agenda. So I'll be sure to include that.
Okay, let me see if I missed any of the questions in here. There's also a bunch of great resources being put into the chat. Information on ADA self-evaluation and transition plans. An article from the Boston Globe about sidewalk access issues in the city. Judy Shanley put in the chat, Transportation Research Board, TCRP, has produced several studies on wayfinding that can be considered in improving sidewalk accessibility. Some great studies there. Let's see. Oh, one question was, how compatible is the app with current wearables, watches especially, which have robust haptics?
So one of the things, this might be more of a phase two, specifically for the Sacramento. One of the things that we're building in is are those haptic alerts. So it will have audible alerts, it will have visual alerts, and then it will also have haptic alerts. Haptic alerts, just buzzing whenever something's approaching. That part is I'll say easy. It's common. The thing that we'd like to do is how can we take that to the next level? And I think this actually goes back to even the standards question. I believe there are standards around what a short buzz means or a long buzz or things like that. So what we intend to do is build that into specifically the haptic alerts so that maybe when it does a short buzz, that means a left turn. And when it does a long buzz, that means a right turn. Or maybe a really long buzz means you're approaching a hazard. So utilizing those standards in development, so to build that into the feedback from those haptics. So that is, I think, probably something that might be more in a year two phase of that project, but it is very much part of the approach that we'd like to take. Doing a map on the Tiny Watch might take a little bit more time, but haptics is closer than a tiny screen for navigation.
Judy Shanley commented, I think what's important is to help people become advocates for accessible sidewalks. We have a youth advocacy program to help youth educate their communities about sidewalk accessibility. The challenge is, whose responsibility is it? And then Hank replied, in 3/4 of America, property owners are responsible for the maintenance of the sidewalk along their property. Are there any best practices, places that come to your mind of places that manage this well that folks might be able to advocate for?
For those that, so my experience is that the majority of the country, also the property owner is responsible for repairing the sidewalk. When it's something like that, it makes it tough to sometimes to make improvements, because you're now putting that ownership on the property owner. What I've seen is, I don't know these are best practices, but what I've seen are, I believe it's Chicago has a shared, like I believe they help to refund property owners maybe 50% to split the costs. I also know that a lot of projects out in California, I don't know actually who's responsible for the property out in California, but I know a lot of projects out in California, that's not as much part of the conversation as conducting the transition plan to then become compliant. So it kind of almost puts aside any of those local policies at first, because the mission is to become accessible. So then from there, I'm not quite sure how they designate who's responsible and who's not. But my experience is, whenever it's the property owner who's responsible, it can become very challenging. So what is often needed is probably a funding source of some sort, whether it's within the city or whether it's through government funding, to be able to actually make those repairs. The one that does come to mind, that who took ownership, is we did a project about 8 years ago in Louisville, Kentucky, and they said, we are going to own the sidewalks, we are going to fix and repair them. So that was the first one that we experienced that took full ownership of their sidewalk network.
Thanks, Eric. Let's see. A comment here, a few comments on this. Federal Highway Administration provides a map with links to state DOT ADA transition plans and inventories. The link is in the chat. Judy says there was a court case a couple years ago in which a business owner, a new building developer, won a case that essentially said they were not responsible for the sidewalks around their building. How can we help businesses see this as their responsibility as well? Hank says some communities have moved to charging a fee for sidewalk maintenance, and then the city assumes responsibility for maintaining and building new. So some ideas and comments about that there in the chat. And it looks like
A quick thought around that, if you don't mind. I don't have a good answer for that, but my goal would be that, as tools like the wayfinding and navigation grow, that now it actually drives the need for accessible restaurants and points of interest. Because at the end of the day, a lot of times these businesses are looking out for their bottom dollar. And sad to say that they don't necessarily care about accessibility. They just care about if people are coming in. So how can we potentially utilize our navigation, our tools, or whatever it may be, to push that envelope, so that maybe it means that they're driving business by driving accessibility. So I don't have a good method for that right now, but that would be the goal.
thanks, Eric. And it is the end of the hour here. So thank you so much again, Eric, for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending this office hours. Feel free to reach out to Eric. He put his email there on the screen, or you can reach out to ATRC, and you can reach out to ATRC. I will put my email in the chat as well.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Grayson.
Great. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye.